We are really excited to talk about this very specific topic. It is how to set up a game space, just like the TechBag game spaces or Buffalo game spaces and all sorts of other game spaces. So we're going to basically cover a bunch of topics on this. It's going to be interesting because Jamey and I are both co-founders of the TechBag game space, and we'll probably go a little more into detail about that. But here's what our agenda looks like. We're going to talk about what is a game space, getting started with setting up one up, events and communication between how to get people joining in on your game space, legal and organization structures, fundraisers, volunteer and organizers, well-being, and then finally normal Q&A sections. So let's talk about what a game space is. And Jamey, would you like to start kicking this off?
Sure. So there's no, one definition of what a game space is, but there are certainly common elements that you can identify among places that call themselves a game space. Generally, it's a place where game developers gather. That's the thing that's pretty consistent across all of them. And often there's a component of, gathering in order to support each other in some way. So co-working is a very common aspect of game spaces. For all the people who might be working from home, working out of a basement or wherever it might be, working in isolation. It's a space for all those people to come together and build a community and support one another. And there's lots of different flavors from there. Some have more of a focus on sort of being an accelerator or an incubator for businesses. So many game spaces offer some aspects of business development support for their members. But generally, they all have, the kind of physical space, community, and, various other forms of support.
Mm-hmm. Here you can see where the TechBag game space is located on the upper left-hand corner. That also is where the center of gravity makerspace is located. So some interesting situations can occur. Some game spaces are co-located, like in our case, with like either a makerspace or another co-working space. And some of the cool things that ends up happening in that sort of situation is a sort of a creative collision where those in the makerspace have the capabilities of creating alternative controllers, while those in the game space knows how to do any sort of software development. Anyways, we're going to keep moving on. So getting started. Yeah. Man, it was a long journey. Yeah. Getting started. So this is the preparation sections. What sort of research that you should be doing before you start putting together a game space? The question was, is that you, Jamey, in the picture?
Yes, that's me.
Yes.
Ages ago.
Ages and ages ago. That's what the back of his head looks like.
In case you ever wondered. Now you know.
This was one of our first co-working space that we went with. But yeah, in regards to, I know, Jamey, that you did a lot of research in regards to pulling together a game space. Like, what did you find out about that?
Yeah, so we had the idea for the game space a while before we actually started up the space in any form, and I just wanted to get a sense. I mean, this wasn't an idea that just kind of came out of nowhere. There were already existing game spaces popping up kind of as a trend in different locations. So the first one that I remember hearing about was LA Game Space. That was quite a prominent one. That started up that, kind of helped define the concept to some extent when it wasn't really as much of an established thing. And then by the time that we were looking at starting up, there was Game Collab in Arizona. There was Buffalo Game Space, which was especially influential for us, just seeing these things kind of working in locations that weren't necessarily like an established game development hub. And a few others, Indie City Co-op in Chicago. There was Philly Game Forge in Philadelphia. And there are some in Canada as well, in like Toronto and Montreal. So there were a bunch popping up all over the place. So what I did was I just wanted to get a sense of how they operated. So I put together a set of questions, just a questionnaire. It was generally pretty easy to find contact info for the people running these spaces. They tended to be pretty accessible. And most, if not all, of the people that I emailed, people running all the spaces that I just mentioned, responded, were kind enough to answer all the questions that I sent. So I was just asking things like, what are sort of your primary costs, both in terms of startup and ongoing? What do you kind of focus on as a space? Like what sort of gives you your own unique flavor for your community? And just like practical questions like that. Again, things like organizational structure, which we'll talk about. So what I found was there really was a wide variety of different approaches people were taking. And while there were some common challenges, the challenges also tended to be distinct to the approaches that were being taken. So, for instance, Game Collab in Arizona was much more in the kind of incubator accelerator style. And so one thing I noticed looking at their website was they had a huge set of like sponsor organizations and partner organizations. So I really was wanting to kind of pick their brain about how they managed to kind of get buy-in from all these different groups. So they were really helpful in answering that, and so on and so forth. So just asked some specific questions. And yeah, did a lot of research ahead of time. And then aside from that, the other bit of research that we did ahead of time was locally in our own area, right? So it's all well and good to find out what's working and not working for people in other regions, but what may or may not be working in Chicago, for instance, some of those things will map to us in the capital region of New York. Some of them won't necessarily map directly. So getting a sense of what the needs were here in our local region was also important. So did a lot of initial outreach to local game studios, starting especially with people who I had worked with in the past. So asking people like Toby from First Playable, who gave me my first job in the industry, what are some of the challenges she's facing? What would make it worthwhile for like her and her company to support what we're doing? And what I found there was, the main thing that studios were struggling with in our region was talent acquisition, basically, and they just like filling skill gaps, and they were needing to spend a lot more on recruitment because they're needing to recruit people from outside our region. When if there was kind of a bit more of a pipeline established, then they would love to hire more people locally. So they were kind of strongly encouraging us to have an educational component to what we're doing. Which thankfully was something we were already thinking about anyway, which we can get into a little bit. But that was some of the research.
I would only add like a few other things in there. Look up what sort of paperwork you need to file. In particular, have a code of conduct as early as possible. We definitely started with one. It was not well advertised, so we made sure that we fixed that over time. But generally speaking, you should always make it clear on like every meeting that you start moving forward where the code of conduct is, what it briefly says. Obviously, don't recite it every single meeting because it's going to inevitably be very long, and like make sure that you have volunteers constantly enforcing that. I would also argue that it will be a good idea to make sure that you have enough people in your enough people who are willing to volunteer and who are especially willing to build the community as well. We started with 4 co-founders, if memory serves correct. And I mean, it's kind of those that are still sticking around with the organization has whittled down to just us 2 right now. But that doesn't mean that we have like this relatively large coordinator team that is keeping the oils well cleaned. Excuse me, what am I saying? Anyways, the metaphor being like, make sure that you have people in the community who clearly demonstrate that they're willing to put together and really go through a good mile on making a community in the local area.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, another form of kind of you could call it research, but also just like outreach that we did early on was just looking at what are the existing outlets for game development community locally, right? So, and the most prominent one for local game developers, which is the IGDA Albany chapter, had been well established for many years in the area. So that was a place where already sort of the group that we were trying to reach and gauge interest among was, easily accessible. So, when we had this idea, Taro and I actually met up at an IGDA Albany meeting, and I was just sort of asking around, talking about this idea to try to see who might be interested in getting involved and just enthusiastic about it. And Taro was extremely enthusiastic about it, which, just that alone started to give us a sense of momentum. Yeah.
Only other thing, I think we talked about this briefly, just make a decision on whether to make it a for-profit or non-profit, and obviously look up the paperwork necessary to set them up, which I think leads to... No, it doesn't. Events and
So
communication.
Close. So close.
Events and communication. Yeah. So events is definitely something I can talk about. What sort of events worked, and then communications. I think I'll probably toss that to Jamey here.
Sure.
But yeah, what sort of, I guess, in regards to game space, you want to make sure that you have some sort of unifying set of events, regular meetings, and so forth to make sure that we have a clear presence in the area. And definitely when Jamey started the group, he started off with a meetup group, posted that we were going to have a meeting under the parking garage in this weird desolate location. Yeah, great memories.
Center of Gravity's original location, to be fair.
The center of gravity.
Not just a parking garage, but...
The rooftop would constantly dribble with rainwater and snow water. Anyways.
From humble beginnings. How far we've come.
All right. But when we were talking to each other about that, we made the ambitious goal of having a meeting every week. And to an extent, I think that worked as a strategy. The idea being that we want to make sure that our meetings become a regular habit for any members that are interested. Would I recommend every week for future game spaces? Not really. Every 2 weeks, if not every month, would perfectly suffice. But it is actually kind of important to mention that with each meeting you're having, it is always a good idea to have some sort of topic in mind for discussion. So the 3 different sort of events that we commonly do, actually 4 now that I include game jams, is game jams, obviously, lessons. Any sort of specific topic lesson nights are really good. Any professional talks as well, also excellent. The showcases, so being able to showcase what the community has made. And finally, an actual social where everyone just goes to a bar or a restaurant, or in our case, we just have a social right here with a bunch of board games, and just have a fun socialization aspect of things. There are some few other events that we do here and there, including community updates. Community night is an excellent time for us to talk about what sort of new stuff has been happening in our community. We have bundled that together with a community showcase event, so we do like a 2-in-1 kind of thing, because admittedly just hearing us two talk about these are the cool things that are happening is, it's gonna get you about an hour, and it's not exactly the most entertaining information for most people. So you gotta say and we're going to be showing off X and Y game this night. It would make it really appealing as well. Lesson night was something that we were we put together a voting system for. So it is always a good idea to have the community explain what sort of things they can teach and what sort of things they're interested in, and try to see where in the Venn diagram you can kind of match those 2 topics together. Anything that meets in the middle is the stuff that you're going to be teaching with. Generally speaking, lesson nights should not be done more frequently than once a month, because people who are going to end up teaching it is going to at least need that much time to actually set up the lesson. If not, you're probably going to want to take up a little more time, maybe even up to 3 months long for them to set up the talks, because I mean, let's be honest, it's actually a fairly exhausting thing to put together a presentation and say, like, here are the things I'm going to talk about. Here are the things I learned about, say, how to use Unity. So it's important to make sure that you're giving enough leeway and time for the speaker to be able to put together the materials necessary to have that. Game jams is, we do a regular Ludum Dare game jam and include, or whatever hashtag include, I guess, series of game jams. And those are fairly easier to set up, believe it or not. It's mostly promotional work that takes up the most amount of time that I found. But so long as you have like a venue for an X amount of time, you communicate with the venue and let them know, like, if the venue lets you know, here are the limitations that we have, such as when they're going to be closing the doors because you're not, event goers are not allowed to stay for that long time, or like, where the bathrooms are, whether you can bring in food or not, that kind of stuff. It's definitely important to cover all your bases on that. And if you do plan on getting kids in your game jam, there is a lot of legal paperwork behind that. So it's something that, for example, Global Game Jam, the organization that is, discovered, turns out to be a little more complex than initially expected. So that's a quick warning to all of you that you might be a little careful on that. I believe Global Game Jam Next, for example, gives all the paperwork necessary to make sure that the game jam organizers have a confirmation from their parents that they are allowing the organizers to take some, mostly little, responsibility for conducting an event and being with their kids. So there's that too. Social nights, it's really simple. Go talk to a venue. If they say, yeah, that's okay, then go for it. Most venues would be fairly happy to have a lot of people coming in. So there's no reasons to think that that's going to be pretty bad. Showcases are also fairly low key as well. Usually, if you're a game developer, you have your own computer, so you'll be probably bringing in your own laptop, desktop, whatever to show it. Ideally, which is what we do, it would be better to have it inside an actual computer lab, so that the computers that are being used as a computer lab themselves. However, I would definitely talk to the computer lab first to make sure that you're allowed to install applications on said computers. If they, long story short, say no, then you might as well just have it in a regular venue that doesn't have computers, and let the developers show off their game that way. And how about communications? Sure.
So as Taro mentioned when he was describing some of the events that we do, for some of them, they're fairly low key. If it's like just a social night, sort of networking gathering, the event itself may be, may not require a lot of overhead to run. But for pretty much all of them, what's common is that there's a fair amount of promotion work involved. Just in order to spread the word. So there are a couple of general suggestions that I have. One trend that I've noticed among game spaces that kind of managed to garner some momentum is oftentimes before there is any physical space that group kind of owns and operates, which is a big undertaking, of course. Often there's a community already that's gathering, whether it's online or in person on a regular basis. So they kind of build up a community in the same way that we did, in that early on, we were meeting at the center of gravity before we had our own space. And that was just a chance for people to, for us to start to build a community, find some people who might be interested in volunteering. Again, just continue to gauge interest in how much do people actually want a physical space? Like, if that's something that we do, is there going to be enough interest for it to be a worthwhile endeavor? So if you can start from that point of already building up some amount of community, even before you have the physical space, then I think it helps with communication a great deal. You can get a fair amount of word of mouth, just from that initial enthusiasm of the group itself. So there's a lot of precedent for this. Rock Game Dev, who, recently within the past year or so, established their own space. They were just a monthly meetup for developers in the Rochester area for quite a long time before then, and really only undertook the steps to start to gain their own physical space when there was a high demand from the participants in this meetup group for that to happen. So it happened quite organically in that case. And so that then they already, have a bit of momentum behind them. And that helps reduce the amount of initial promotion that you need to do to just spread the word. Same with, say, Another Castle, our neighbors over in Massachusetts. They, as far as I know, were primarily a Facebook group or just online group that had a fair number of members called Pioneer Valley Game Developers. And then from that, the idea of a physical space sort of evolved. So it was similar with us, although we we progressed quite quickly from just being a meetup group, which, as Taro mentioned, is how we started. So in terms of initially spreading the word, it was very helpful for us to just have this group that was meeting on a regular basis, but also to be promoting it through a platform like Meetup that already had an audience built in, like checking like people who want to find out what's going on in the area. They're looking for meetups. That was essential for us initially in terms of communication, in terms of finding our audience, in terms of, we knew the people we knew, but we also brought in a lot of people that we didn't know because we were promoting what we were doing in a place where they were already looking. So that helped a lot. And then aside from that, I would say, thinking about things like the frequency of events is quite important. So we started with we actually started even a bit more ambitious than Taro was describing, I would say, in that, we started with weekly meetings on Meetup. And then we also had this idea of doing like a larger event every month or two. And the weekly meetups were really just to find the core of the people who were really wanting a community that they could engage with on a regular basis. It's like, the people who are interested in showing up for a weekly meetup, there was a fair amount of overlap there, and the people who wanted a regular co-working space as well, and the people who want to be there, every weekday, 9 to 5. But I would say, we had all these types of events that Taro described that kind of initially grew organically in the same way that I described other groups getting a physical space organically as a response to demand in an existing population. I guess the other thing that I would say, which ties into communication to some extent, is often community initiatives, whether it's events or something else, will arise organically. But the kind of initial people who were kind of pushing for that may or may not be able to continue to organize that piece of the puzzle on an ongoing basis. So I would suggest, and this is something that we talk about a lot with our own group because we run quite a large number of events, is you do need to kind of periodically, I think, revisit what you're doing in terms of events, and just make sure that you need to do some pruning from time to time, particularly as you start to see some success in your events. You'll naturally sort of be encouraged by people in the community or people who just have a cool idea to do more of them. And that's great, but you also then need to sort of like prune from time to time. And that relates to communication in that, of course, the more frequent your events are, each of them has an associated communication burden that goes along with a certain amount of time. And that can become quite time consuming. The amount of time that goes into properly promoting events is something that's easy to underestimate, I would say. So.
All right, well, moving on. Legal and org structure. Wow. Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that it's kind of important to put together and make a decision on whether you want to be a for-profit or a non-profit organization. I think if you're putting together just like a meetup group, there isn't exactly an explicit reason you need to be an associated group. Well, I guess the first question would be like, what is the advantage of being a for-profit or a non-profit organization? And while I cannot speak for-profit stuff, I can speak about nonprofit a little more. Nonprofit gives you the additional advantage of, really having like a corporation / organization gives you the legal protection of your own assets. so that if you have like a business then and somebody sues the business, it is the business that loses their assets, not you as an organizer. And similarly, like if you're pulling together a nonprofit organization, you're making sure that the responsibilities, that the legal responsibilities of something bad happening, which should be rare and few and far between, but in the situation that does happen, it would be up to the organization, the nonprofit organization, to hold responsible for that, any sort of assets that they happen to have, any sort of materials that will be under that umbrella, while you yourself as a coordinator won't have to actually lose that, won't actually have to lose, your house, potentially your car or whatever, because that's not part of the organization. So anyways, I believe each state has their own policy on how to put together a nonprofit and what sort of limitations exist in all of them. So it's always important to check what your state says. There's also obviously the federal level of being a nonprofit organization as well. And most of the time when you're trying to get like any sort of nonprofit benefits from various different organizations, maybe a free GitHub account or whatever, it's worth noting that they are looking for a federal confirmation of the fact that you're a nonprofit. So definitely look up both of them, what their procedures are. They're not exactly the easiest thing to do, but they're not also all that complex either. Like the questions that they ask you are fairly human readable. To be fair, I would recommend having an attorney just in case, but generally speaking, it's not too bad for, a layperson to review and realize like, oh, this is meant to be like a form that anyone can read and fill out. But it is quite long and exhausting. We definitely had an attorney in training, so to speak, but an attorney work on ours as well.
Yeah, just to elaborate on that. So it can really help kind of expedite the process if you're applying, say, for a 501c3 nonprofit status, which is a pretty typical approach for nonprofits to take if you have people with some experience doing that. Because we incorporated quite early TVGS within our first 6 months or so, I would say. But we incorporated as a nonprofit, but only as a New York State nonprofit. We did not immediately apply for federal 501c3 status. And I think actually like not that many people realize that you can do one, like the by far the more typical approach, as we learned later, was you apply for the statewide incorporation and then you pretty much immediately apply for the federal 501c3. Yeah. Yeah.
So if you're establishing a nonprofit, you have to establish it at both the state and federal levels?
So the question was, if you are trying to establish a nonprofit, do you have to establish it on both state and federal level?
That is the typical approach, and that is the approach I would recommend as well. We took our sweet time with the federal thing, which is something that you can do as well. So you're still a recognized corporation, on the state level. I would recommend, do the research up front or find somebody you can work with who can then get you started with the federal application, whether it's 501c3 or some other form. They are separate, yeah. We were a state incorporated nonprofit early on, but it was really like a few years until we successfully negotiated the federal 501c3. And so that was a lot of us kind of learning as we went, but it's really important, I think, for us to acknowledge we would not have gotten there as soon as we did without Patrick
Totaro.
Yeah, Totaro, thanks. Patrick Totaro and Sarah Lauser, who were both absolutely instrumental in helping us achieve that. So the benefits there, as Taro covered to some extent, are once you have 501c3 status, and a reason to kind of get that process started as early as possible is then donations that are made to your organization, which is a big piece of how many nonprofits sustain themselves. The donations are tax deductible. at that point, whereas without that status, they're not. So it makes it easier to solicit donations. You can also apply to be recognized as a charitable organization, which TVGS is as well, which then affords you some other additional things that are helpful on top of that. And the other big thing, arguably as big or bigger than tax-deductible donations, is it makes you eligible for grants. Many types of grants require you to have federal 501c3 status, or you just can't apply for them. And as a game space, generally speaking, I think you'll find many of them are nonprofits. I've noticed the general trend is more of them are nonprofit than for-profit. Not across the board, but I think a big reason is video games, thankfully, are well situated in an area where, because they involve technical skills and sort of STEM skills, STEAM, yes, of course, and also art skills. I say STEM and then art because so they involve digital art, music, all these other creative skills. They are at this kind of nice nexus point where you can sort of apply for lots of different grants in different areas. So you can apply for arts grants and, demonstrably show that what you're doing is relevant to that. And same with sort of, any engineering related grants. And business development grants as well, economic development. So that's a big benefit, I think, of being nonprofit. The other thing for us, a big part of our early decision, these were things that we figured out as we went along. Our initial decision was just kind of about what are we trying to accomplish as an organization, right? Are we trying to do this so that a few people can get rich, or are we trying to do this so that we can enrich our community collectively? And it was definitely the latter for all of us. So again, not to say that for-profit corporations can't also enrich their community in various ways, but it did seem to lend itself to a nonprofit structure in that sense.
I didn't really go over the organization structure portion of the things, but believe it or not, the legal documents that you'll be working on for signing up your federal 501c3 pretty much tells you what the legal structure or what the organization structure should look like. I'm going off of memory here, so please do your own research and please confirm that I am correct, or you can tell me at Twitter at Omiya Games that I am totally wrong. But anyways, let's see. So my understanding is that it needs to specify, you need to have a bylaws that specifies what your organization does. That is definitely something where I would highly recommend having an attorney draft for you, because that's definitely something that's not immediately obvious or easy. And it also has to be compliant with your state's requirements of being a nonprofit as well. Said bylaws, I believe, requires you to specify how many board of directors there are. So there's going to be a set of board of directors, and I believe the minimum is 3 people. I believe it needs to establish who the founders of that organization are. At least for New York State, that is 3 people. It needs to establish who the officers are. And officers are like executive director, secretary, and treasurer sort of stuff. There's also, in the board of directors, you need to specify who the chair is and the vice chair is. And I believe those are the bare minimum requirements. If there are any other official positions that you'd like to add, for example, the Tech Value Game Space has coordinator roles that does not fall under officer or board of director roles. Those can be listed. And coordinators, of course, is someone who, in our case, works under the executive director. The executive director is someone who executes what the board of director asks of the organization. And then there's also the necessity of defining who members are of your organization. So there's a lot of legal paperwork that you need to do. That's what our legal structure looks like, organization structure, looks like. But yeah, believe it or not, that's something that you're going to learn very quickly if you're talking to an attorney to establish these paperwork. You're going to learn very quickly that they have these requirements, and you're going to want to start researching and asking people which roles that they want to take in. So choose wisely. Now you're informed.
There are also some things that, whether or not they're legal requirements, and to be honest, I'm blanking at the moment, I would definitely recommend. So one has to do with insurance. You should do some research on insurance and what your needs are. We found in applying for certain types of grants that in addition to requiring something like 501c3 status, many grants require you to have particular kinds of insurance. So there were a few baseline.
I think there were general insurance was what they're asking.
There are other ones that many people recommend. For instance, what's called DNO, directors and operators, organizers. I can't remember, but that's essentially a type of thing that limits the personal liability of the board of directors. Members of the board of directors have certain legal obligations to the organization, duty of care, and a few other duties. Basically, they need to be paying attention to what's happening and maintaining oversight, in a reasonable way. And they need to be acting in the best interest of the organization and not doing anything that's a conflict of interest and being quite careful about that. But yeah, much in the way that the kind of corporate structure, you can pick one that sort of limits your personal liability in terms of like your own assets and just legal risk as an individual. There are types of insurance that also help provide some additional protections there and just, makes it easier to entice board members because again, you're sort of minimizing their personal legal risk in being a board member.
Yeah. So please do your due diligence and do research on that. This is, of course, if you're specifically asking for donations to continue the continuation of your organization. That's where like these sort of information becomes actually kind of vital. But especially as you're starting off, I would argue that it's not immediately necessary to get all these paperwork done and filed. So if you're hearing this and you're being like, wow, that sounds like a lot of work. I mean, I'm not going to lie, it is, but that's not going to that shouldn't be a reason to stop you from putting together a local community at your area, especially if your local area doesn't have like very prominent or very large game studios to prop it together. Like it's totally possible to put together a game development community, a game space, between just a bunch of hobbyists and indie developers that are trying to, that has their own full-time / part-time jobs that is funding their endeavors. So, don't let this be a factor in making your decision or in a negative way in a factor of your decision making for putting together a game space. It can definitely come in later.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are various ways to negotiate this, right? Like, I've seen game space groups or sort of co-working meetup groups that just all meet up at like a bar or all meet up at some other existing place where they're not actually responsible for the space, but they've worked out some kind of deal. There's lots of ways to kind of get going with it. And I think, consider lots of different options because there is a bit of setup involved with these things. And even if that's just a stepping stone to get to where you actually want to be, you can kind of get up and running. So I would, just second what Taro said in terms of like, don't let these things dissuade you or discourage you. They just take a bit of figuring out. I would say just be aware of them because there can be sort of hidden costs if you just aren't aware that that's something that you'll probably need to deal with at some point. So in looking at, and when we're talking about research, we kind of skipped over this. This is quite an essential piece, but research the costs. I guess to mention that a little bit up front, but I can't emphasize that enough. Like do an estimate of your upfront costs for how much it's going to take you to prepare whatever space you're in, if you need any equipment, right? And then the ongoing costs. What are going to be your main costs and how are you going to meet them? So for most game spaces, that includes just like the rent for the physical space being the primary cost. Any utilities, can stack up, internet and just keeping the lights on, as you've noticed in this presentation, can be dicey. That was more a motion detection issue than a payment issue, thankfully. And aside from that, though, like insurance does then tend to be the next highest cost for many organizations in terms of an ongoing, because that's going to be a recurring cost for you. So and then legal, especially initial, right? Initially pulling a space together. Legal is going to cost a lot. Do not be surprised. And there are costs for filing these things like 501c3 status and things like that. So,
were there any questions so far, or?
Yeah.
I think it's important to know that in addition to just doing the research on what kind of paper we can file and everything, it's okay to do one thing at a time. And it's probably going to start with like if you're in local organizations like small business development council or anything like that, and trying to go like free business advice.
Yeah.
Take full advantage.
Yes.
Because they will make sure that you don't screw it up.
Yes, absolutely. So
Before we go too far, to repeat that comment just in case, what was said was make sure to take things one at a time. Also do your research and seeing if in your local area there are any sort of free business development, free legal services around, and to take full advantage of those. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. No, I appreciate it. I was going to repeat it, and I'm glad you took care of it for me. Yeah, so that's exactly right. Well, these are challenges. They're common challenges to like really any nonprofit, right? So as a result, there are experienced people who can help you, and there are organizations often that are quite cost accessible if you can just sort of identify the local resources in your area, whether it's Small Business Council or others.
Yeah.
Great advice.
As it turns out, in most places, they want more businesses. Hi. Yeah.
That's another thing. So we didn't talk about it too much. I think if we just flail our limbs around, yes, that's the secret.
I mean, the stream can't even see what the inside of our room looks like. So this is going to be a fascinating
Make
thing.
sure to research if the location you're at has motion detecting lights. That's switch off automatically. I can't stress that enough.
We need to make them heat detecting lights.
Clearly. So one thing that we didn't talk about was just doing research on like real estate in your area, what physical spaces are available. So one of the things that enabled us to get up and running, so we started with no budget, let's be honest. Like we started we had the budget to pay for the meetup account of like $15 a month or whatever it was. We just started as this grassroots thing and grew from there. But we very quickly were able to identify a physical space that we were able to move into. Granted, it was it was a little shoebox, kind of broom closet office. But it was something, it was a physical space, and we locked that down within the first few weeks of us having the meetup group. So all of a sudden it was just like, hey, we're not just talking about this, like, let's go next door and check out the space. And that was a huge deal. And really the only reason we were able to do that was, we did a fair amount of research in terms of just making connections in our local area, and especially talk to people that we knew had like also been doing research on spaces recently. So we talked with the organizers of the Center of Gravity who were allowing us to host our meetup at their space. But they were also in the process of moving into a new space. So they had just gone through their own set of research in terms of what spaces are available. And while they were looking for things that might have differed a bit from what we needed, they were able to connect us with some local folks in the city that were in Troy, New York, who basically had lots of available space and were looking to utilize it. So we got kind of a sweetheart deal, which enabled us to get up and running, with a sort of rent deal that scaled to our number of members, which was incredible when we were first growing and didn't have a huge number of paying members. So I think doing that sort of foundational research as well can really be a big deal. We were just talking to the organizers of some other spaces who were talking about being like on the verge of signing a certain deal that would commit them, to like a lease for a year or whatever it was, and then getting a call at the last second from like somebody else saying like, don't sign that deal yet. We've got like somebody else who really wants to support you and it'll just be much better for you. So not committing to like a deal that's going to be challenging for you, but trying to spend some time up front to find a good deal on the space makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that was in Rochester too, so fairly populated city.
Yeah.
Especially compared to here in Troy.
Right. Those challenges, of course, will vary a lot according to city. Like we happen to be in a location where real estate costs tend to be a bit lower on average. And also just people are wanting to kind of encourage local growth. So that's enabled us to kind of get started much more rapidly, which was huge.
Yeah. Let's see what our next slide is and hope it's fundraising. Oh,
yay. Hooray.
So yeah, Jamey, you did a lot of research on how other organizations did this. For our part, we largely focus on grant writing a lot, trying to get grants in our local area, membership fees, donations to Patreon and other sort of venues. It is definitely a hard topic because there's as it turns out, money is not easy to make. They don't grow on trees.
Who could have foreseen?
Yeah, I know. But yeah, in regards to like how other organizations did, when you did your research, what did you find?
So generally, okay, here's the first thing I found when I sent out this questionnaire to lots of people running game spaces. There was a common theme, which was co-working is very difficult to make function as a business on a consistent basis, because generally co-working goes month to month. And so you can kind of have ups and downs in terms of your number of members, and it can be very unpredictable. And that was from the perspective of like general co-working spaces, like this is just a challenge for making that work. When you then stack, when you're a game development focused co-working space on top of that, you are adding another level of risk in that game development is inherently a volatile business. And a lot of kind of indie studio startups tend to be very sort of hand to mouth in terms of their operating costs. So you have a lot more kind of people who might come on and be very enthusiastic about it, but unfortunately for them to be able to make the ongoing payment to remain a member can be quite a challenge. So that was something that folks advised us about a lot, which was do not make like co-working membership payments your only source of income, or you'll be setting yourself up for an uphill climb. So we have sort of multiple sources in the way that we run things, and I think they'd be relevant to most game spaces. So membership payments is one aspect of where we get funding. In our case, we have a particular focus on education at our space, which we haven't really elaborated on that much, but that is another source of income for our group, and that's kind of on par with membership payments, at least for us, because we do quite a bit of it. And the nice thing about that is tends to be more of a consistent thing, that there are always people who want to learn how to make games. And if you're like us in that you're not solely focusing your education around industry training, then, at least you're avoiding whether or not there's as much demand, in terms of like jobs at the tail end of that. If you're just teaching people for the sake of like doing it for its own sake, then why not? It's a good thing for the region, and it's a good thing for us. And it's something that can scale up, in that like right now we teach a lot of classes and we're nowhere near meeting the demand that there is in our region. That's very clear. So that's another one where it's something that in our region, and I would expect most regions, it's like sort of an area where there's just a lot of growth that you can do if you have a community that's interested in sharing their knowledge, which thankfully we do. Grants, as mentioned, so there are some that are nonprofit specific, and I think so. There are pieces of this that kind of change in terms of fundraising avenues that are available to you if you're for-profit versus nonprofit. So when you're nonprofit, you're not likely to get investment from the sorts of people who are investing because they want some payoff at the tail end, right? That's not really a particularly viable avenue for nonprofits. So that closes off one sort of type of investment for you, but you gain so much more in terms of, again, access to grants and just like people if there's enough people in your region who want to see something like this happen, and you're doing things that are demonstrably like good for the area, then you just need to kind of be soliciting donations on a regular basis. That is not to say that simply doing that will then mean the donations start rolling in. So I would say, grants and donations are an essential component for nonprofits. It is very easy to underestimate the amount of labor associated with getting like any amount of money coming in either avenue. So, I mean, this is why grant writer is its own paid job that people have, because it's a set of skills. We've kind of tried to learn it as we go along, and it's a challenge. Even just learning what grants are out there that are available is like just took us a while to kind of find that out, where like the portals to get this kind of info. But then actually writing them is it's a lot of paperwork to apply for any grant, and a lot of time and effort. So I would say, if you're able to but if you're in a fortunate enough position to be able to budget to pay somebody to do some grant writing for you, then that's the type of thing that can, be very worthwhile as an organization. Same with fundraising, right? If you're able to pay somebody who has those skills, that can make a huge difference. If you're not able to, and we were in that situation, for instance, again, starting up as a group with no budget, an alternative approach is, I would say, really think about the skills you're looking for your board of directors. Mm-hmm. Because that is one of the typical sort of expected duties of board members is fundraising. Mm-hmm. And it'd be good to be clear with your board up front so that that's understood, because while that is a typical thing for a board to do, your individual board members may or may not be aware of that. And if you can find some people who are enthusiastic about what you're doing, who want to be a part of your board and who also have those skills, that's a huge deal. Mm-hmm. And yeah, same with like grant writing and fundraising both. And that goes for really any things on the kind of business side. You really want to think about the types of skills that you want for your board of directors and try to get a nice mix of expertise. And if not for your board, then try to kind of just establish relationships with some people who are willing to advise you. When working with nonprofits, a lot of companies and individuals kind of are willing to or anticipate giving some kind of discount. Of course, not everybody will, but the assumption is you're doing something that's meant to be like a social good, and a lot of people really are willing to kind of help work with you in that case.
On a more positive note, things that are actually very easy to get fundraising for is any sort of donations, especially in regards to physical goods. So let's say, for example, you have a community of game developers, and you're like, all right, we have this new space. What do we want to fill it with? Well, it's going to be actually surprisingly easy to find, granted, probably old at this point, furniture to fill in. Chairs and desks in particular were pretty easy for us to obtain because, as it turns out, the local area has a lot of places where businesses just kind of abandoned. So we get to just, stealing is the wrong word. There was something that the landowner lent to us. It was
donated to us.
Yes, it was donated to us. People will easily donate a bunch of games, game consoles, and a TV to get comfortable on the couches and start playing video games all day. So that we have literally a game cabinet that's currently in lockdown right now. But anyways, we have literally a game cabinet that has over 200 games in it and still rising, thanks to all the people who have contributed. It's possible to get a few computers, granted not great stuff, but people who were like, we were about to throw this away, we might as well pop them here. So that might be a really quick and easy way to create a local server to, host a few simple repositories and other web services that you can probably imagine. I would not recommend hosting your own website. However, you should definitely get a legit cloud service for that instead, because you don't want that going down all the time. But yeah, no, those tends to be a lot easier to do because, as it turns out, just generally speaking, in almost every country and state, they want an actual STEAM group. They want more technology coming in. They want more technical jobs available in the area. And so anything you can do to kind of sell that is always a good way of getting more contacts, getting more eyes on you, especially from a government perspective when they want to start helping the local business area.
Yeah. I would just say a couple other sort of pointers on the fundraising side. One thing that I found seems to work well is if you're sort of trying to do a fundraising campaign, really focusing it around a particular goal or sort of multiple goals where it's quite clear to people what they're donating for, rather than just generally donating to the organization. The more transparent you can be about here's an awesome thing we want to do that we hope you'll be excited about as well. And if you are excited about it, this is the amount of money, we've already thought about the amount of money that we need. And when we meet this amount of donations, we'll do this cool thing that that will benefit you and others. So that helps, just having quite concrete goals. And that's why you'll see a lot of crowdfunding campaigns are already kind of structured that way, right? With these sort of incentives in mind. Yeah. The other thing that I would say is, as I mentioned, so there was one particular co-working space that struck me when I was doing this research up front, which was Game Collab in Arizona. And they had all these partner organizations. And it was the same center of gravity, actually. We were talking to them early on because they were quite successful in sort of garnering fundraising, financial support, not just from individuals, but from organizations of various kinds in the area. And that's just like a lot of outreach and a lot of sort of making those connections. But what the Game Collab people in particular recommended to me was the way they said they were able to get that amount of sort of sponsorship and actual like financial backing from these organizations was just to do direct outreach to them, like talk to them about their general concept, but mostly ask them about their needs, right? And just ask them up front as directly as possible, like, what within the purview of what we've described that we're doing, like what could we do that's not too far off from our mission, that would make it worthwhile for you to be kicking in a certain amount of funds, and just have that conversation as directly as possible. And that's not out of line at all to like go do that. A lot of organizations will respond very favorably to it, but just having a very clear ask, I think, can make the equation a lot simpler for people.
Absolutely. All right, next slide. Volunteer and organizer well-being. Wow, this is a big topic.
Yeah, save the best for last.
Yeah, saving the best one. Yeah, this is definitely something that will be worth sitting down with your community and discussing, preferably early on, but just generally, like, I think it's a good idea to at least have yearly, probably at least twice or 3 times a year, discussion on where you're at and whether the community is experiencing any sort of burnout or not. That's really what this boils down to. Are you burning out? Are you being too successful? Or alternatively, are there too little members? What sort of new strategies do we want to implement? So, we had more of the burnout problem in our case. We've dealt with a lot of successes, and with that comes a lot of pressure and figuring out how to deal with that. And admittedly, for some of us, I think we definitely needed to approach that problem sooner rather than later. That's definitely a concern that I personally felt like I didn't do a very good job of addressing sooner. But, you know, it's probably a good idea, knowing how many people are volunteering and helping out your organization, to say like, these are the number, this is the absolute maximum frequency of events we are willing to conduct. Because inevitably trying to conduct as lot of events as possible is going to be your what you're going to be leaning towards, because one, that's something that people tends to recommend anyways, but two, it's also an opportunity to get more people to gather at your location. So it's always like, it's going to be good marketing regardless. You want to get more people coming into your location more frequently, as many times as possible, but that tends to be exhausting both for the audience and the volunteers working to put that together. So always have an upper limit on that, and have a regular meeting discussing where everyone is at and deciding whether we want to expand that, increase that upper limit, lower that upper limit, so on and so forth. If you're dealing with the problem about the fact that, people are not attending your event nearly as often, it may, at that point, some ideas include changing up what sort of events you're conducting, perhaps ask around, so definitely survey around for people who have left, like what was their reason for leaving. But I would also argue that it might also be a good opportunity to ask about what sort of venue you've been having your meetings at, and seeing if changing that would do any good as well. That's something that we are at least discussing with another organization that I will not name as of right now. And we're definitely reviewing a couple of different strategies on how we want to approach that problem.
Yeah. So this year at a game developers conference, there was a meetup of game community organizers. And actually a lot of the topics that we covered in this were sort of the same topics that they covered in that discussion. And one of the things, so I was recently reading a write-up from that. I wasn't able to attend that in person. And one of the things that jumped out at me as being very resonant to our experiences was they were talking about how on this particular topic, the thing that they found was really common across like game communities, game spaces, was people were not so much grappling with failure and like how to succeed, is they were grappling with success, right? They were grappling with all of the, sort of scope increases and all the requests and all the kind of things that are exciting, the exciting opportunities that come along when you start to garner some success and momentum within your community, and kind of trying to figure out how to strike a balance there with, particularly with making sure that they weren't trying to take on too many things and causing burnout, because that is sort of the number one risk, I would say, for a community that is garnering some momentum and is successful, is that can be a very hard balance, and everybody has to kind of find that right balance for their own community. So a really common theme in this discussion, and I recommend reading the write-up, we can kind of share the link, is that as these communities started to grow and succeed, then there would be some expansion in terms of what they were being asked to do or encouraged to do, and they would start to try to expand a little bit, but often the pool of volunteers that they had and organizers would remain the same size while that was happening, and only at a certain point would they realize, like, okay, we've gone a little too far now, and as Taro mentioned, like, once that's happening, then burnout tends to be sort of the natural result of it, and burnout can really have a profound impact on things very quickly if you don't kind of address it very, very immediately. So that was a common theme there. It's definitely something that's we've experienced in terms of, particularly with the number of events that we conduct, in that the people who originally were organizing them and like who wanted us to do them may or may not currently be a part of our volunteer pool. So we would sort of default to having somebody else try to take it over so we could keep it going. But, at a certain point, start to realize that, in fact, our default should maybe be taking a hard look at what needs to be pruned, instead of just assuming that we should be perpetually trying to continue these things with the same size group of volunteers. So that's a challenge. And I would just say, like, more broadly than that, the people are more important than like any individual initiative or event that you're doing. Like, it's really the overall feeling that people have about the community and how supportive everybody is towards each other, and just how you're treating people as individuals, is like, all of that is more important than like the cool shiny thing that like seems like an opportunity that you don't want to miss out on. Mm-hmm. And I know, like, just for myself personally, it was very tempting. Like, I would sort of default in the early days, especially, to being like, oh, this organization wants to work with us. Like, amazing. Yeah, we'll definitely do that. And now we're at a point where we're sort of being a little more judicious about that. And thankfully, we're still in a position where we have those opportunities. But we also need to make sure that we're not acting on those opportunities at the cost of individuals within our community, because that really needs to be our first priority, is the people.
I would definitely also recommend reaching out to your volunteers, or even just a pool of people, and see if anyone is interested in taking on certain workload off of you. Always aim to delegate, because trying to pull everything onto yourself is inevitably going to get worse over time. Yeah. It's totally understandable that everyone wants to have, events or things done your way. But as it turns out, a lot of people out there are more than willing to help make your vision possible, and are willing to pull aside a lot of differences as a consequence of that. So, always trust people, assuming they have not demonstrated any ill will, which can happen. That's fairly few and far between, but you'll see the red flags. Assuming you have socialized with a lot of people and know about communications really well, those red flags are going to be generally very obvious. But assuming that they don't have those kind of situations, definitely loop them in and make sure that everyone is up to date and know what sort of things that they can help out with.
Yeah, absolutely. And try to identify where your main kind of where you're expending a lot of your effort as an organization. And there are areas of, again, like, that require a lot of labor and just a lot of time and effort that can be like non-obvious until you find yourself in that situation, right? So like, it's seems a bit embarrassing to say at this point, but it really was not obvious to me the amount of promotional work on an ongoing basis that would be required for something like this. So that was one that we kind of started to realize over time, like, oh, we really need a dedicated like person, and really ideally a team of people like on this to make it a reasonable workload for anybody. And there's lots of things that can pop up like that. It'll vary from group to group. Moderation is another one that's like not only a lot of labor, but can be a lot of emotional labor involved, right? So for instance, like we started up a Discord at a certain point within the past few years and had a moderation team. And that was just like a lot of work to continue to monitor things. And we needed like a group of people where when somebody got a little bit, when somebody needed a break from doing that, other people could step up and fill in, things like this.
Yeah, we quickly abandoned our office live streams back in the good old River Street days, where we only did that like 3 or 4 times before we're like, this is a little too much. Believe it or not because people thought it was, I mean, there were also people who thought it was creepy as well. But mostly because there was a lot of questions coming through, and it was just too much for us to answer those questions while trying to do our own work at the same time. I mean, if you want to do that, that's all great and all, but I don't personally recommend it for co-working offices.
Yeah, when anticipating, where moderation is going to start to grow in scope, anything that brushes against the internet, it's a safe bet that the moderation challenge is going to increase. Yeah. Sometimes, yes, which again, maybe quite obvious to say, but good to anticipate.
Next person, you have to start moderating moderators.
Yeah, moderating your moderators.
Yeah.
That's fun.
So those types of situations where you need to like potentially moderate your moderators, as Ms. pointed out, or just generally, I think clarity helps, right? With moderation, with anything within the community where you need to unfortunately take some sort of like disciplinary action, whether that's at the extreme end, like banning somebody from the community, or just like letting somebody know like, hey, what you're doing is not cool and like you need to stop. Having very clear guidelines, like that goes back to what Tara was mentioning about the code of conduct. Like that's why you really want that at the absolute beginning. And it just helps reduce uncertainty in those situations, which is very good for everybody involved, moderators and community members. Yeah,
it really brings out a standard expectation sooner rather than later. And especially when you have that sort of stuff done sooner, it becomes easier to address disciplinary actions on a later basis, because we're saying like, look, this is the standard we set out and you have violated it. Like, if they're coming in with no standards at the beginning, then they're going to start off with all sorts of assumptions. So that's always going to be a huge trouble that, if anything, you want to make sure is resolved sooner. That said, we're not saying that it's always going to be, the code of conduct is not going to be ever, it's written on stone and it's never going to change. No, that shouldn't be of the expectation. It may or may not be useful that writing in there somewhere. It's always useful writing in there somewhere a little bit of leeway to make sure that we can add in occasional, like you can have edge cases and be able to say, this is where it falls under this little quirk right here where it says it's going to be under the jurisdiction of whoever is enforcing this rule, that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's always important to do as well. Yeah, I think that about covers it. And then finally, the last slide is questions.
How have you murdered anybody yet?
The question was, how have we not murdered anybody yet? Believe it or not, most people who have attended our events, participated in our game jams, been an active person on our Discord server, so on and so forth. By the way, our Discord server does have like a clear procedure that you have to follow before you're actually accepted in. But anyways,
which entails accepting the code of conduct, accepting the code of conduct.
But yes, the short answer is because, as it turns out, most people are really good. They really, if they are going into your organization or they heard about your organization and wanted to join into your meeting, they're coming with the perspective of community building. They're coming with the perspective of socializing, learning what sort of people are around. And it's hard in that kind of environment to be like particularly evil, particularly terrible person. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It frankly will happen, as I hate to say, but the world is large enough, and in fact, even if you live in like some sort of shanky town or whatever, there's probably going to be someone in there that's just not going to be a great fit for your organization. But regardless, for the most part, most people that come in are totally supportive, and that's usually what's been keeping us held together in these tightly knit quarters and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess for me, in terms of how I have not murdered anybody yet, it really does come down to that phrase Taro just used, which is tightly knit, in that we've had multiple community members say that like TVGS feels like a family to them. And so, you know, families can be frustrating. You know, the challenge does come when you do need to take quite extreme measures in terms of moderating or potentially banning somebody, when you have that sort of feeling about lots of people and that you ideally do view them as like a family, right? You're sort of like excommunicating a family member, but ultimately, that's something that we occasionally, rarely, thankfully, need to do in order to maintain things. And so you do need to still be willing to do that. But like having those procedures in place and having a group of people, like when we've had our most extreme moderation challenges, which mostly had to do with, again, our online presence rather than anything in person, we had a whole team of people and a set of procedures. So in terms of just the emotional, like the immediate visceral reaction to it, I mean, you know, I won't lie, we're all just venting to each other, like the moderation team, about like, why is this person doing this? And like, don't they realize, like, you know, just how difficult of a situation this is? And like the kind of tone that, like the way it's having a negative impact on the tone that we're trying to establish and maintain. So we support each other to kind of like, it's helpful just to have other people who can say like, yes, I also think that this is frustrating, right? I also feel the same way. That helps me not to murder people if we can all sort of like just vent together, but then also work together to take the appropriate actions according to our process. So that helps. Yeah.
We've been not exactly great at documenting our, not procedures per se, but taking on specific roles, what sort of little quirks that we have, how we use our equipment, so on and so forth. But if I were to provide any advice as to anyone that is starting a new game space, preferably hire someone to do that. But of course, if that is not within the purview, document as much as possible. Any sort of policies, any sort of like, here's how to use this computer, which are things that, while not human based, are certainly things that are going to make your blood boil as you soon realize that computers are not working the way you want to, and so forth.
Yeah, I would say as your community grows, there's sort of a natural consequence of that tends to be that you start to accrue more like organizational structure just policies on the administrative and leadership side, just to kind of clarify things. And there's always a balance, right? I think that was a challenge for us early because we were such a kind of grassroots, like organic thing when we started. So there were some things that we knew we needed, like code of conduct, just to make it like, just to be able to enact our values and make it like a safe space and things like this. But other things are like, we're a bit of a balancing act in terms of like, what's the right amount of procedure and structure to clarify without it becoming like a total bureaucratic nightmare, you know, where it's sort of like the procedures overwhelm the sort of like individual connections, I guess. And I think we've done okay with that balance, all things considered. But yeah, it's another one of those things that's like I guess a hidden challenge of these sorts of things.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
Though the wording could have used a little help. For the moderator on the chat, if they can let us know, we do not have the computers in front of us, so we can't actually view the chat right now. But for the moderators on the chat, if they happen to know if there are any questions, feel free to walk into the door and let us know. Yeah, exactly.
You're good, Taro.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
You got a confirmation from the moderator who.
Speaking of
brought you to the
moderation,
door that
how about
there
a
are
hand
no
for Chris,
questions.
our moderator for this stream? Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
If you guys don't know, we're great to talk on the topic for next one.
Oh, sweet. Yeah, that might be cool to talk about. I don't think we announced that on our streams per se, but do you have any questions, Chris, yourself? You do not. I'm trying to think of a question here. Oh yeah, statistics to keep track of. That's actually a really good idea.
Yeah, okay. The most fun topics.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so
metrics to
metrics.
keep track of each time you're having like an event, or like when you have a co-working space, what daily information you want to track, that kind of stuff.
Sure. So, yes, there are a lot of reasons to keep track of these things. I mean, one is just, again, for your board of directors, I think you periodically want to be looking at the metrics in order to be maintaining oversight. And, so it's good to identify what things sort of indicate the health of your organization in terms of what you're trying to do. Also, just for grants. So we started tracking quite a few different metrics that we hadn't really been as focused on tracking before because various grants needed us to report them. So we do a lot of events, and for every event, we do our best to track attendance. So there's a sign-in for the event, which, can be slightly cumbersome, but it really helps us in terms of just grant reporting, things like this. Right, exactly. So
Everyone should do it.
yes. So the grants, of course, are an important source of money for us, and our ability to, report the relevant metrics means we're more likely to get future grants and for the people giving us the money to be happy with us. So, I would say anything that has to do with the income of your organization, certainly in terms of monitoring the business side, I would recommend tracking. So typically that would be like number of paying members. If you happen to be like teaching, then like we keep track of the number of classes we're teaching and which classes they are, the number of instructors that we like train, and kind of try to keep a pool of instructors available. So that's one metric as well. We do track things, of course, like the income that we're getting on a monthly basis from teaching, things like this. But then there's other things just, that are, I think, more interesting from a creative side, like how many game projects are how many new ones are there? How many ongoing ones are there? There's other, what are some other ones that you would say?
Volunteer hours.
Yes, absolutely.
Number of volunteers for active volunteers for that matter, and like when they last volunteered, how frequently they have volunteered, so on and so forth. Venues. If you happen to be a venue hopper, it's always a good idea to have a list of venues and how many times you attended to each one, when you have last attended to them, and if there any issues were brought up as a consequence of that. Equipment usage, like how many hours it's being used. Preferably if you have like a literal reservation system for when people are using the equipment, that's probably going to be the best idea. There are a couple of services out there that has like a barcode system where you can print it on the printer, tape it, and then scan it through a mobile app to make that happen. So that makes the process a lot easier, so on and so forth. Those are some things that immediately crosses my mind that are also useful metrics to keep track of, either because of legal reasons, grant reasons, and just generally speaking, they're good stuff to keep track of anyways, to let you know how well or how poorly your organization is doing.
Yeah, and all of the things that you mentioned, especially to do with like utilization of equipment, speaks to this. But tracking your number of paying members is one thing, but if you're like a physical space, then tracking not only event attendance but also like co-working utilization. Like you may have a certain number of paying members, but what's the actual subset of those who are actively co-working in your space on a regular basis is an important thing to gauge as well. Yeah.
Surprises that we've encountered that we did not expect while doing this.
Do you have any surprises?
Yeah, we have a mice problem. So we used to regularly serve snacks and food during our event. We don't do that now per venue policy. But the venue policy also was like us, where they'll just kind of serve food and events food and let it out whenever. But as it turns out, that was not the greatest idea, as it created a hive of mice and probably ants too in our location. So we now have like a policy where everything has to either be in a fridge or clearly enclosed in a cabinet that they have absolutely zero access to, or containers, excuse me, not cabinets. So that was something that surprised us. You're going to quickly find out that food is a very quick and easy way to convince someone to attend your event. It's because free food is great for that, but make sure you have a policy to clean up after yourself.
Yeah, and like somebody to kind of who's not shy about enforcing and like mentioning that policy. Yeah, I would say like, so in our first space that we were in for our first year, there was nobody to clean. Like we were the cleaners.
Janitors.
And so, all the things that come with like a shared space in terms of sort of diffuse responsibility, where it's easier for any individual person who doesn't want to like clean up after themselves to be like, oh, somebody else will do it because it's a shared space, right? All the fun things about like having a roommate, but just like amplified. Those are things that would be, I guess, hadn't occurred to me so much, the extent of like, oh, people do like gross things. And then if you're running the space, you have to like be the one to deal with it, whatever that might be. So yeah, that's a good one for people to think of ahead of time.
To kind of go back to our, metrics to keep track of, another thing that's also a good thing to keep track of is, and this will loop into surprises, I swear, to keep track of is who donated what, or who donated how much money, or any sort of stuff like that. In particular, like let's say a lot of people are donating a bunch of games in there. Somebody's going to probably come back and say, hey, I want this back, in which case you'll be like, where did it go? So definitely have like a good metric on making sure that you know where things are.
Yeah.
Who it belongs to where.
Yep.
You may every once in a while want to check to make sure if said thing actually works. I don't know if our Atari works at all because we don't have any TV to confirm that it works.
Yeah, no, I definitely second this, like inventory tracking, and then like security, right? Like these are also challenges of a shared space, and that people will be bringing in their own stuff. A lot of spaces will like rent out, say like storage lockers and things like this. You need to decide, like, obviously how you're setting up your workstations. If you're supplying things like that, are you just expecting all your members to have a laptop? If so, like people are going in and out a lot, like do you have security cameras, like front door locks, like how do people access the space? All of those logistical things as well are, something that can cause some surprises if you don't think about them early on.
The last surprise for me was the fact how much media I had to generate and how much things I had to learn as a consequence of that. These includes graphic editing because, hey, I need to make flyers. This includes audio editing because, hey, we record podcasts. This includes video editing, which, we record these live streams and we need to figure out how to cut it, how to improve the music, how to splice things together, how to cut out the uhs. And oh my God. And people are probably going to balk at my workflow. It is terrible. It's using as many free stuff as I can find online to make it happen. But it works. Yeah, it works. I cannot count the number of times people were like, wait, Blender can edit videos? And I'm like, yes. it's terrible, but it can do it. And I figured out a workflow to make it happen. So, yeah, it's a good way to build your experience in learning how to put together your own game trailers, because you're going to quickly realize that, oh, these are actually important to community development as well.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of like I still like get a bad taste in my mouth using these words, and I shouldn't. But like you're building your brand, right? And just like branding and marketing, right? Very important, like not something that you can afford to be like, oh, we don't need to do that. Like that's, it is essential. So like making press contacts to get some press coverage for your game, just having like a nice logo and some things that kind of make you look like professional.
Know how to record a ZIF, which is a GIF. I'm a complete jerk when it comes to figuring out what the pronunciation of that word is.
These things, you know, depending on where you're coming from, like might seem like they're not something that you would think about prioritizing at first, but has a big difference in terms of the way people perceive you. Mm-hmm. I mean, your brand is sort of like the first thing that causes people to form a first impression and perception of you. So, yeah, it's, you either like learn how to do that yourself very quickly, which is sort of has been our approach, or, you know, you need to allocate some money up front to pay people who already know how to do it.
Yeah, I think that's how like we discovered Restream, because we're just like, it's such a pain trying to set up YouTube and Twitch at the same time and separately, and having two computers running, and they're like, why not just use Restream? And it's like, that exists? What? So like, yeah, it's always interesting to kind of mention on the community, like, we have this problem. Do you know of an easier solution? They're like, what, you haven't heard of this? They'll probably tell you in exactly those words. And we're like, no, we didn't know. But now that we're enlightened. Any other surprises from you, Jamey?
Oh, I know there were plenty along the way, but nothing springs to mind.
Nothing springs to mind. Yeah. No, those are always fun surprises. I think it was...
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Thanks.
This is very informative.
Glad to hear.
Yeah. Oh, it might be useful to also know a little bit about project management. I think just learning how to manage in general is actually a really useful skill set. We both have software development backgrounds, so our project management style has been through Agile Scrum method, and there's not exactly a one-to-one way of making it work in all nonprofits, let alone most nonprofits. I would argue most nonprofits, it doesn't really work specifically, because you're not working towards a specific product. You're working towards an ongoing service. But nonetheless, or that doesn't have like, you know, regular releases and that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, like having that sort of background in how things are managed, how things are led, and how you organize your tasks is also a useful skill set as well. That is not really a surprise to me. We figured that out very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, having some people, assuming you're a community of game developers, like if some of those game developers are producers, then like, you know, see if you can get some of them involved in your leadership team, and that'll make a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah,
Thanks.
that's all I have.